Greetings, dear listeners, and welcome to Tales from Aztlantis, where we take you on a journey through Chicano, Mexicano, and Mesoamerican history and archaeology, and we help to combat the spread of disinformation about these very topics. We are your hosts, Kurly Tlapoyawa.
And Ruben Arellano Tlakatekatl.
What is going on, Dr. Tlakatekatl?
Well, it's beginning to look like fall over here in Dallas. Finally getting some cooler temperatures, so
Nice.
that's a good thing. Fall is my favorite time of year.
It is also my favorite time of year.
But isn't it always fall in New Mexico?
No. I wish. We go from like literally, it's a joke, but literally in one day you could go through all four seasons. And
that's the same joke here in Texas. I mean, you'll find that that's true in a lot of places.
It's awful. Some people like it, but I really just prefer the fall.
Yeah. So anything new on your end?
Not much. Just we had a big Halloween themed party for my daughter, who just graduated from Boston University.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Yeah, we're very proud of her. And speaking of Halloween themes, we are joined today by the preeminent state historian for New Mexico, Mr. Rob Martinez, who is here with us today because we're going to talk about some brujeria here in the great state of New Mexico.
And he is a return guest. We've had him before. Was it season 1 or season 2?
Season 1.
Was it
like
season
an early
1?
episode. Yeah, so
nice.
It's been a while. How are you doing, Rob? It's so good to have you back.
Welcome.
Orale. Thank you, guys. It's great to be here, as usual, talking about our amazing history and culture here in Nuevo Mexico, which is connected definitely to Mexico, to Mesoamerica. But before we move on, there's an old saying from the central part of Spain, really hot part of La Mancha and Castilla. It says something like, 9 meses de invierno, 3 meses de infierno. There you go. So there's some weather that might kind of apply to New Mexico, or at least parts of New Mexico.
For sure. Well, when I was in Belize, the Maya guys on my crew, because it was in the middle of summer while we were there, they said, well, we call this the punishing time.
Wow.
The punishing time.
Because it was so hot. And it was like 95% humidity.
Oh, you can't breathe there.
Man.
Yeah, it was rough. It was rough, but beautiful
place. How do
these
people live there? Seriously.
I know.
I mean, it's bad enough here in Texas, but I can't imagine 95% humidity. Wow.
Wow.
So that is something else.
Come to New Mexico. We have 0% humidity.
All the time. Like we could have 1% humidity and people start freaking out. Like, oh, what is
cancel
happening?
School, cancel work.
Start choking up. I can't breathe.
Can't breathe. So
yeah,
we're gonna talk brujeria, and it was a few years ago. I don't remember. Was it before COVID, or what we call before COVID, or after COVID? My wife and I went and saw you give a talk on brujeria in New Mexico, and it was really fascinating stuff. And it was like standing room only. So
yeah, that was at Corrales, the old San Isidro church. That was a couple of years ago. And we had 150 people jammed into the little church there, and another 150 who stayed outside of the church just to listen, which I thought was really cool. I think it's a subject that resonates with people, and it's not just a Halloween thing either. I think it's a universal thing, this idea of people, women, but also men, who have influence over things that we need help with. And sometimes the church or the government doesn't do what we want them to do, or they don't help. So people go to saludadoras, entenderas, curanderas, people who help us with our health, our not just our physical health, but our spiritual health. And in New Mexico, just like in Mexico and all over Latin America, there's this blending of all of these ideas about spirit, about religion, theology, good and bad, evil, benevolence. And from Spain, we get witch tales and sorcery, the European side of things, but also in Spain, you get Jewish stories of witches, and you get Muslim stories, and they're all blending over there. They come over here first to Mexico, and they encounter Mesoamerican, Aztec, and Tlaxcalan and Cholulan, and all those diverse Mexican native peoples and cultures who have their own stories, their own cosmic vision and spirituality. And they blend in the 1500s, and then they're brought by colonists in the late 1500s to Nuevo Mexico, where they're already Pueblo people with their own stories of good spirits and bad spirits, and good shaman, but also witches. And it all blends with Apache, Navajo, Comanche. Do you see where I'm going?
Absolutely.
It's quite a soup we have here. And it's in our DNA, it's in our bloodlines, it's in our language and our foods, our cultural expressions, our artistic expressions, but also in our witch beliefs. And it all begins to come together in the early 1600s when a Mexican Indian woman, Maria Zamora, comes to New Mexico as a colonist. And she's the wife of a Spaniard, Bartolomé Montoya. And around 1607, she's accused of brujeria for having to try to kill her daughter's husband, giving her a powder to give him. And it's amazing when you hear what she was doing, you read the documents. We have these original documents, which are rich in Mexican cultural, ethnic history, but also Spanish colonial, with the stories of witches and incantations and hearing knockings on the wall, and the appearance of a strange animal. And Maria supposedly rode her. She also supposedly abused peyote. So there's also that idea of drugs, natural drugs, which are used in spiritual rituals amongst Mexican Indians and different groups. Well, that is here in New Mexico in the early 1600s. Imagine that. Isn't that fascinating?
It's wild.
It is.
And
that's
one of my
part of our heritage.
Absolutely. And to touch on that, one of my favorite parts of the story is that she is, when you look at these documents, it says that she was born in San Sebastian, which is the name that the Spaniards gave to the barrio of Atzacoalco in Tenochtitlan. Yep. So she was born in Tenochtitlan, and she married Montoya, and just both of these people are like common ancestors to so many.
Exactly.
Like
I was going to say that.
Yeah, she's my, I forget how far back great grandmother, and she's even my wife's our great grandmother. And so when I told our daughters, like, your ancestor, she got accused, because she was a peyotera, and they were like, hell yeah.
Well, first to your point, and I was going to make the point, but thank you for making it for me. Muchas gracias, señor. Lo aprecio mucho. Look, mira, Bartolomé Montoya is a Spaniard. He's a common ancestor. And a lot of people just emphasize that, he is our ancestor. So is Maria Zamora, a Mexican Indian. And we know she's Mexicana because their children are all listed as mestizos. They're mestizos. They're some of the first New Mexicans. And out of the gate, we have Mexican ancestry and Mexican culture, Mesoamerican, native Mexican. A lot of people will argue, I've heard people argue with me saying, oh, but we were only part of Mexico from 1821 to 1846. And so we aren't very Mexican. It's like, not true at all. 20 years later, Beatriz de Los Angeles and her daughter Juana are also accused. And Beatriz is a Mexican Indian woman, which means she has a similar background. And they both learned these things from their Native American, Mexican Indian mothers and grandmothers, and they're really operating within a Spanish system, but it's not a purely Spanish system. We have to really look close and see they're doing their own thing, and people are coming to them for help and assistance. They're accused of brujeria. They're accused of hechiceria, sorcery, and they might have been doing these things, or it might have just been native religious expressions that were filtered through Spanish Catholic perspectives. So we have to be open to looking at all of these things, but they're also common ancestors. So that first colony in the early 1600s, we have already a lot of Mexican Indian in us starting right at the beginning.
Yeah, right out the gate.
Mhm.
Yeah.
If I may add to what you were just saying about how people want to push back on the notion that that there's not that much Mexican influence in the Southwest or specifically New Mexico, right? And I think the reason why they say that is because, well, there's two reasons. First of all, they don't understand that the Mexican identity is not just the national identity, that it's originally the Mexican identity referred to, namely people who were called Aztecs or Tlaxcalan people, people from Tenochtitlan and so surrounding areas, and those people were described as speaking Mexican language, right, which was Nahuatl. That's what they called it.
Mhm.
And so when we talk about Mexican culture and Mexican ideas and Mexican ways, like life ways and things like that, we're referring to that part of it. And people don't know that, and so they mistakenly conflate the term Mexican with the current national identity,
Yeah.
which is similar to saying I'm an American from the United States. That's national identity. And the same thing in Mexico. There's a national identity for people who are born there, and they don't have to necessarily be people who are indigenous or who descend from indigenous people. They could be people who immigrated to Mexico. There's a lot of European immigration in Mexico, especially like in Mexico City and a lot of the major cities, that people don't realize that not just the United States has received a lot of European immigrants over the years, especially in the 20th century, but Mexico has as well, right? I mean, look at the current president, the new president of Mexico. She's a Mexican woman of Jewish ancestry, right? So there's a misconception as to these terms, and we've been kind of like talking about this for many years, but I think it's one of those things that people just don't really understand the difference between an ethnic identity and a national identity, right? And that's kind of
Well,
what you're getting at, right?
yeah, I mean, look, Placido Domingo. He identifies as Mexican, but his parents were from Spain,
From
and I
Spain, yeah.
believe he might have even been born in Spain. But he embraces the mariachi tradition. He embraces his Mexicanismo. Look at Salma Hayek. I think she's part Lebanese, Middle Eastern, but she's Mexicana. And it goes the other direction. I look at our New Mexico, Nuevo Mexicano culture as a regional Mexican culture.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I look at it. Of course, there's Spanish elements, just like there are in Mexico or Central America and South America, the Philippines and the Caribbean. But it's not just Spanish. There's heavy elements, and not just from the Valley of Mexico, but even from Sonora and Chihuahua and those native groups of northern Mexico that are also part of our caldo, our caldito of DNA and bloodlines and culture. And so that's how I look at it. So when I look at these stories of hechiceria, you can find a lot of this in Mexico. You can find all these stories of hechiceria and brujeria. La Llorona is a universal story. It's not puro Nuevo Mexicano. That story goes to Mexico, probably all over the Spanish-speaking world. And, this idea of brujas, my grandma believed in brujas. She was from Mora, and she said there were many brujas in Mora. And there may have been. I'm open to, because my grandma was an intelligent person. She was also an angel, but I also wonder if she also meant curanderas,
Yeah.
who sometimes the word kind of took a twist from curandera to bruja sometimes when people might have got scared of somebody, or the idea that, well, they're doing good with their curanderismo, but they also seem to know how to cure hexes and curses. So maybe they know a little bit about that side
Mhm.
the spirit world as well. So in these stories, you always see the native peoples of Mexico and New Mexico, or the blacks. They're the scapegoats. They're the
Mhm.
culprits of the bad things happening in a community. Typically, they're blamed for these things. In the 1760s in New Mexico, at Abiquiu, where the Genizaros were, those are the children of warfare. They were Comanche, Ute, Kiowa, Apache, Hopi, all those different native plains groups that went to war with the Pueblos and the Spanish, and vice versa. Everybody was doing it. But these Genizaros are other. They are different. They aren't quite Catholic. They're not quite Hispanicized. They're like immigrants coming into the United States now who get scapegoated for
Mm-hmm.
things happening in our country. And so there are accusations of hechiceria, that there are hechiceros, there are men and women in the 1760s. And it's a Catholic priest who's making most of the accusations. But we have this tradition here, and it's not from one culture, it's from all the different
Mhm.
cultures. And you definitely see some native cultural attributes being turned into witchcraft and sorcery by some of the officials, the both Catholic and civil Spanish officials in New Mexico in the colonial period.
Well, that was a
Absolutely.
tradition among especially the missionaries. Like I studied the missionaries here in Texas and what they did with the Coahuiltecan people and others in South Texas and northern Mexico. And one of the things that they would do is immediately demonize everything, right? And anything that has to do with, especially like you going back to what you were saying about the peyote, you know, the ritual used, the sacrament that's a Coahuiltecan ceremonial tradition. And one of the few documents that we have from the period of the early colonial period here in Texas comes from a missionary who was translating the language, one of the Coahuiltecan dialects, and he was creating a glossary and sort of a handbook that he could use to communicate with Coahuiltecan peoples and the other missionaries after him could use. And some of the things that they would ask are in Spanish, right? They would ask him, do you consume the peyote? Do you eat human flesh? Right? Like immediately jumps from peyote to human flesh. Are you a
Yeah.
cannibal? Are you a brujo, a bruja, a witch? So immediately, and so the ceremony that Coahuiltecan peoples practice back then, and it's stuck, and you still hear people who follow the tradition who refer to it as a mitote, and the mitote we know is something that goes back to Central Mexico, to the danzas, mitotilistli. It means some kind of celebration that involves dancing, singing, and so nowadays when you talk to very traditional Coahuiltecan peoples, they say, yeah, well, we're going to have a mitote this weekend, and they're not talking about danza azteca or anything else. They're talking about having a medicine meeting, you know,
Ceremony.
and the ceremony. And so immediately, like these connections, you can see how the way that they were doing it in Texas is the same kind of pattern that they're doing in Nuevo Mexico and California. I'm not so familiar with it, but I'm sure it was probably very, very similar.
Well, that's interesting. This whole coming together and clash of religious expressions is what we're also seeing here. Look, the religious orders of the Catholic Church that came to Mexico in the 1500s were the Franciscans. Later on, there were Augustinians, Dominicans, and then Jesuits, of course. But the ones that came to New Mexico were Franciscans. The Franciscans looked at Native American religions as demonic, not the people, but that the people were in the grip of some demonic spirit that needed to be expelled, and the people needed to be saved. They needed to be liberated from this. Whereas the Dominicans would look at the native religions in Mexico or South America and say, these are not demonic, they're just in error. They're like Adam and Eve, expelled from the Garden of Eden. So they would do that. So when the Franciscans first came to New Mexico, they were obviously alarmed and shaken up when they saw the Pueblo religious practices and dances and these things. And so they went to great efforts to try to stop them. But think about this. from the 1600s to the 1800s to the mid 1800s, think about the blending of spiritual expressions in New Mexico and cultural mixing going on in all directions. By the time Jean-Baptiste Lamy comes as the first bishop of New Mexico in 1850, he looks at us Hispanics. He doesn't look at us Nuevo Mexicanos and say, wow, this is amazing, pure, great Catholicism. He thinks we have been co-opted by Native American groups and that we need to be re-Catholicized. So he brings in the Christian Brothers, the Sisters of Loretto, and the Jesuits, because he looks at our penitentes, he looks at our santos, and he looks at it and says, this is not Christianity. This is not Catholicism. This is not healthy Catholicism. So things don't necessarily repeat themselves in history, but I can't remember who said it, but they say history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes.
Yeah, that's
it
one of my
rhymes.
favorite quotes. I think that's Clemens who said that.
Yeah, and
Samuel
you get
Clemens.
and you see that happening here in New Mexico. 300 years later, all of a sudden, our Nuevo Mexicano culture, which is a mestizo culture, is all of a sudden being looked at as Native American. And so were we, by the way. All this stuff going on in the 1800s and 1860s with Civil War battles, we were looked at for what we were. Mexicanos, Mexicans were described as such in the documents. We weren't called Spanish or Hispano or anything. We were called Mexicans. That's what we were. So that, and we were looked down on, by the way, and considered unworthy of statehood. Just like 100 years later, we were looked down on, but we were okay to send to war to fight for the country, you know, just like Native Americans who had it even worse off.
Well, you had mentioned earlier Beatriz de Los Angeles, right?
Yes.
And Juana de la Cruz. Can you elaborate a little bit on their stories?
According to the documents, which were written down by the Spanish officials, the Spanish priests and Spanish officials, Beatriz was a India Mexicana who had experimented on 2 Indians and killed them with her magic. She was accused of having an affair with a man, a local man, and poisoning him and killing him. And then her daughter, Juana, was also accused of doing the same thing, having an affair with, I think his name was Hernan Marquez Zambrano, that they had, in both situations, they had had arguments with the men who were their lovers, and then the men got violent with them, so the women supposedly bewitched them and killed them. It's similar to Maria Zamora 20 years earlier. And in these cases, there's also this idea of them creating potions that would control love in men, make them irresistible and be able to control them so that they couldn't be with any other woman. So you have these elements going on too. And again, you just have this idea of where are they getting this magic they're practicing, or bad medicine, or whatever it is. Is it in fact witchcraft? Is it sorcery? Is it cultural expression? Is it something that the Catholic priest doesn't understand? We have to keep open minds about these things. I know as a historian, it's not easy because sometimes we want clear-cut answers, but I'm fascinated at the different perspectives. I wish we could talk to Beatriz and her daughter Juana. By the way, Beatriz also married a Spaniard, Juan de la Cruz, who was a Catalan from the area now Barcelona, that part of Spain. They're also common ancestors to a lot of Nuevo Mexicanos. So this goes back. And this mixing of religious expression and spiritual ideals, they're coming together through generations and generation and generation, and coming into contact with other native peoples. So it's there. It's with us. It's in us.
Well, and when you start, because you were talking about how you know, maybe it was the priest didn't understand what they were doing. Maybe it was they were just using herbs for medicine. But you also mentioned that, you know, they had been accused of having affairs with some mints. So when you start mixing in that stuff too, right? You start mixing in love and affairs and relationships. And, you know, if you're a guy who gets busted with this other woman, maybe you say, "Oh, I was bewitched." You know, she cast a spell on me, and so women take the brunt of it that way from these cheating men who don't want to take responsibility for their actions.
Very common, very common. One case from the 1750s was Barbara Garcia. She is accused of using love magic. She's having an affair with a married man. He's not named in the document. We don't know who he is, but she's accused. And it's interesting because Barbara Garcia, later on, about 20 years later, a young woman named Maria Margarita Garcia, daughter of Barbara Garcia, natural daughter, likely the offspring of this love affair, married my dad's ancestor, Pedro Antonio Gallegos, near San Felipe. So, you know, I have that in my ancestor right here in New Mexico, but you're absolutely right. And you know, I have a feeling our ancestors, all of them tended to be a bit superstitious too. There's a lot of gossip, to your point. The priests report our ancestors being very gossipy, using these accusations as just like you throw rocks at someone, and there are affairs going on. These are human. Our ancestors were human. Not looking down on them, but you know, they're human just like we're human today. And they were doing things like having affairs, being attracted, getting caught, and then the spouse getting angry, and maybe the spouse found out about an affair and ran and told the priest that the woman her husband was having an affair with was a witch. That happened too. So it's a tool, just like, you know, you could tie someone up for a year or two if you accuse them of being a judaizante, a secret Jew. They would have to be investigated, all of their goods confiscated, sent to Mexico City to face the Holy Office of the La Inquisición, the Inquisition. So that's part of what's going on as well. And it's not easy to separate it all out.
Yeah, for sure. And then Beatrice's daughter, Juana de la Cruz, her story was really interesting. I pulled up a document. Can you talk a little bit about her? Because there's one part of her story that I found really fascinating.
Well, she eventually married Juan Bernal Griego, I believe. It's interesting. These women were married. It's hard to tell whether they were having their affairs when they were married, while they were married, or if it was before. But by the way, that's interesting. The Griego family were also European and mixed Mexican Indian. Juan Griego was a Greek who came with the Oñate expedition, and his wife, Pascuala Bernal, was Mexicana, India Mexicana from the Valley of Mexico, or Zacatecas, that area. But so you have all,
and Bernalillo, just to interrupt you real quick, Bernalillo is named after her.
Yeah, so you have all these people, again, common ancestors in my family, in everyone's family, who are Nuevo Mexicano, and all of this intrigue is going on. It's almost like a telenovela, you know, all this, you know, forget witchcraft and sorcery. We should just write a story about the love lives of early Nuevo Mexicanos, because it's quite fascinating. But, you know, what I get out of it is just how human our ancestors were. You know, I think sometimes it's easy to put them all in armor, riding horses, wearing royal regalia and clothing, and it's like they're just human beings living their lives, trying their best in situations, and using whatever tools they have at their disposal, cultural and otherwise. I mean, these aren't our Mexican Indian ancestors didn't stop being Mexican Indian just because they married a Spanish guy.
Yeah,
you know?
well,
and it's
in a lot of these documents,
women, you know, that
they're described as like bien españolizadas, right? Like that's supposed to be the, you know,
that's the upgrade.
it's like she's a good
version.
Well, yeah, the India Ladina.
Yeah, India Ladina.
Yeah, and that just meant that they were smart. They were able to really master the Spanish language. But let's be clear,
Or
they
game the
spoke
system,
it,
right?
They spoke, yeah, but they spoke it with an accent. See, that's another thing. They spoke it with their Mexican Indian language accent, and they're passing the culture down to their mestizo kids. So their kids are learning to speak Spanish more like mom than like dad, who's always away. Dad's always away fighting wars, abusing other native peoples,
having affairs,
having affairs with other women or brujas in the next town over. Who knows? But that's why I tell people, when you hear our Nuevo Mexicano Spanish, especially in the Norte, it is not 16th century Castilian. It has some words like from that period, but you're hearing Puebloan people speak it. You're hearing Nawa speakers speak it. They have their accents in there, and the Genizaros, their accent is in there, and it's passed down on and on. And even an Espanol from Spain coming to New Mexico in the 1700s is interacting with these people, and he might have kids with a local woman, and their kids are all of a sudden speaking the same way. Do you get what I'm saying? It all comes down to us.
So back
you
to
were
Juana
saying
de la...
that there. I'm sorry. There's an echo going on.
There is.
I was gonna say, you have do you have any like books maybe that you could recommend to our listeners that talk about the brujas, and or maybe the overlap between brujeria and love affairs, for instance, something that our audience can sink into for this coming season?
Yeah. There's a book by Rick Hendricks and Malcolm Ebright called The Witches of Abiquiu. I had written a master's thesis based on the Abiquiu witches in 1997, which is at UNM. It's the Fray Juan José Toledo and the Devil in Spanish New Mexico. And then the Witches of Abiquiu book came out a few years later. Mark Simmons has a nice little book that talks about a lot of this called, I think it's Witchcraft in the Southwest. And these are all good books on the subject. If you want to expand into Mexico, there are really fascinating books about the Inquisition, the Inquisition, that talks about the different things native peoples were doing that the Catholic Church looked at as possibly heretical. So that's Inquisition documents are actually fantastic sources of social and ethnic history.
Right. And so I'm asking this because it's apparently there's a book that was written not that long ago that talks about so-called folklore in New Mexico, and in one of these stories in that book, and maybe Curly can say more about this, but there's supposedly a reference to the chupacabras going back to the 1700s, or was it 1600s? I'm not sure. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know about that book, but that would be interesting to find out about the chupacabra. I didn't hear about that till I was an adult. I heard about El Sapo in Mora, the man who had supposedly turned himself into a toad, and that was the 1940s. It made it into the Taos newspapers. This shape-shifting, this idea of shape-shifting. And, I heard about brujas. My dad used to tell me and my sister Debbie when we were kids driving up towards Abiquiu, he'd say, look, kids, this is a town of brujas. So we were always hearing about this. Of course, we heard about La Llorona, who was not a bruja, but a woman done wrong, and snaps. So, we grow up hearing these things, and Curly, you had something I don't want to step on what you were saying. You had something you wanted to point out about Beatriz de Los Angeles.
No, Juana de la Cruz, her sister.
Juana de la Cruz, her daughter, the daughter.
Yeah, her daughter, not her sister.
Yeah.
So I found this document from the Cibola Project And if people
Yeah,
don't know, the Cibola Project is like this treasure trove of historic
great.
documents. And you could find, like, they scan the original documents, and then somebody will do a paleography, and then oftentimes there's a translation, and whoever
Mhm.
was behind it, they do really, really good work.
It's fantastic. It is. It's great.
So there's this story about Juana de la Cruz that I just wanted to get your insight or reaction to, because I thought it was great. It says the case of Juana de la Cruz, according to the account of Ana de Bustillos, reporting hearsay from Catalina Bernal. So it's already like a game of telephone, right?
Gossip,
Somebody
mitote.
heard this and told me this. It says, late one night, Juana, in bed with her sister-in-law, Catalina, as her companion slept, went off to spy on her lover, whom she suspected of being unfaithful. When she returned, her bedmate awakened and asked where she had been. She explained that she had flown mounted on an egg to La Cañada, 6 leagues distant, only to find her paramour sleeping innocently by himself. And I'd never heard that before, flying on an egg.
Yeah, I was gonna
Yeah,
say
that.
egg. What
Yep,
is that?
an egg. An egg. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how they did it or how that looked. I don't know if they shrunk and got on an
Right?
egg. I don't know. I have no idea. But in the 1760s Abiquiu case, during there were exorcisms performed by the priest on 5 young maidens of the community or of that area. And during one of the exorcisms, one of the young ladies, or the spirit in her, supposedly accused about 178 people of being witches from New Mexico all the way down to Sonora. And they're listed, they're described. It's a fascinating document. I put that in my thesis. But what's interesting is a couple of the ladies, the women, are accused of being able to fly in one night to Mexico City and back on an egg.
Wow.
So do the documents say huevo in Spanish? Does it say
It's
huevo or what
this
does it
one
say on it?
says caballera en un huevo.
En
Yeah.
un
Yeah,
huevo.
yeah.
Did the term huevo have a different meaning back then that we don't know of?
Well,
Like,
yeah, but we can't say it on this radio show. But
well,
but that
actually,
would look
Actually,
even
you can.
weirder.
you
Okay.
can.
Um,
Yeah,
no,
because
I
I'm
think
trying to is that like a euphemism for something? Like
I
I'm
think
thinking there has to be some kind of like
maybe I've not
euphemism
heard
from the
it.
time that meant something that people understood when they heard that term, like they knew what that meant. I mean, I don't know. It just seems kind of strange.
Well,
Mm-hmm.
it's supposed to be. I think it's supposed to be strange. I think it's supposed to kind of mess with your thought processes. Um, these folks knew what they were doing, you know, and I suspect a deeper dive into witch beliefs and witch tales, perhaps going back to Spain, might reveal something about that, Ruben. It might be some of these descriptions are clearly Spanish witchcraft tales and superstition brought by colonists, then co-opted by native peoples. Maria Zamora in 1607, during her testimony, said, I learned a lot of this from Mexican Indians in the Valley of Mexico. So who knows what the roots are? But that is a very good question. I have no idea. So what I've heard too is it's not it wasn't necessarily on the egg, it was in the egg.
Yeah, yeah.
So that begs even a bigger question of
In
how
the
there's
egg.
definitely some weird spiritual thing going on there. We don't know.
Huh. En un
It
huevo.
it could have even been some form of, to your point about a metaphor or a euphemism, it could have been that they went bilocated, maybe using an egg somehow. I don't know how. I don't want to know, frankly, but
Yeah.
that they bilocated. Maybe somehow they went spiritually to that place, wherever, and then came back. Who knows?
Or maybe you're right. Maybe it was. Hold on, there was what I was trying to say is maybe there was like in their mind the way that they were able to teleport is in some kind of craft that's shaped like an egg. Maybe that's what that was
Maybe.
meant by that.
Well, let me read you the exact. So here's what it says. It says, le preguntó la dicha Catalina Bernal, pues, ¿cómo fuiste? And then she responds, fui en un huevo.
Well, there you go.
So,
there you go.
yeah.
I think it's pretty clear, you know, but we also know that sometimes peyote was part of these rituals. It could have been induced imaginary event. It could have been a spiritual thing that was helped along with peyote. Quien sabe, quien sabe. But we do know that this is what the testimony says throughout the generations. These stories are told. But, you know, in the Abiquiu case from the 1760s, there's also testimony that some of the so-called hechiceros, hechiceras, sorcerers, would take their rosaries off and hang them on a bush or a tree. That was a sign for the priest of rejecting Christianity. And then they would fly. They'd turn into birds and fly to El Pedernal, that big mountain outside of Abiquiu, the flat one that George O'Keeffe painted a bunch of times. Well, who knows? There might have been some peyote being used in native rituals right then and there. That might have been, let's take these rosaries off and do our thing. Let's do our religion. And then when they said what they did, the priest said, oh, brujeria, witchcraft, hechiceria, sorcery. So I don't know. I find all of it really fascinating. And I think, you know, like a person who says, I'm going to only study our history from the Spanish perspective will say, clearly it was witchcraft and demons were involved and demonic possession. But if you want to look at it, like I like what you guys do, let's look at it from this other perspective. Let's go to the other side and see what were they doing here. I mean, sometimes these native folks were being put upon by Spanish political and religious systems. So this might have been a way of getting power in their community or reasserting themselves, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Do you know anything about the story of Domingo Sombrero and his wife, Francisca, I think her name?
That one I don't know about.
So they were both Indios Mexicanos, and I just found it was in, you know, through the Cibola Project. It's a document called An Edict of Faith proclaimed on March 23rd, 1631 in Santa Fe. Elicits formal accusations and confessions of sinful behavior. Commissary of the Holy Office.
I wonder if that was Fray Esteban de Perea who was doing it by then.
Yep, that's exactly who it was.
Well, and I've not seen that, but I'm going to look at it because I'm always interested in these sort of esoteric cultural expressions in our history.
Yeah, so apparently Domingo Sombrero, Indio Mexicano, and I wonder if he was named that because he was a hat maker, or if he just like sombrerero.
Or he wore a hat.
No, yeah, it's sombrerero, actually. I was
he's a
misreading
hat
that.
maker.
Yeah. So Mexican Indian hat maker apparently was, it says, había en hechizado. And so his wife got him some peyote, and together with another native, he drank the peyote. And so like he's admitting all of this, right? Because they were brought up on questioning. And so he was told, well, if you drink the peyote, you'll be able to find out who bewitched you. But apparently it didn't work. And then somebody narked on him because he got in trouble. Like all of them got in trouble for this.
For taking some peyote. Well, you know what? It sounds like, kind of like today, where you're not supposed to take certain drugs, right? Well, that's what the Spanish were saying. In the mid 1700s, there is a case outside of Isleta, Puebla, where one of the shaman there in Isleta was accused of being a brujo because a couple, they were, I remember their names were Garcia. They were from like the Pajarito area of southern, what's now the south part of Albuquerque. They had an encounter with him, and apparently they fell into a stupor, and it turned out he had dosed them with peyote.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. So there you go.
I find it interesting that the use of the ritual use of peyote to a certain extent was being done over in New Mexico, because it's not. I mean, New Mexico. I know that native people there use it, but they usually come to Texas to acquire the medicine because it grows naturally in South Texas and northern Mexico. But
Sure.
someone who comes from that tradition, I find it interesting that you also find all these stories going back to the colonial period of how the use of peyote was being done to engage in these sorts of activities, and it was associated with brujas and brujeria and things like that. So I don't know, I just find it curious.
Well, that's interesting. You should say that. The Camino Real officially brought people, animals, foods, wine, diseases, but it brought other stuff too, either legally or illegally. I mean, that's human nature. If you were living in the Spanish realms, the borders were closed. You could not trade with those British people to the east, or the French or Native Americans outside of the realm. But guess what? It happened. It just
Oh,
was
yeah.
Right.
illicit.
Yeah, I
And,
know.
so I'm sure peyote, it shows up in the document. So it's here. So
Yeah.
it's finding its way here one way or another.
Wow.
And have you another story, just real briefly, is Doña Inez, and she's described as India Ladina Mexicana, and that
She's Tano Indian, I believe.
and that she used her personal charms to arouse a strong passion in a blacksmith, Diego de Moraga. Do you know anything about that?
Someone needs to do a story. Maybe I will, or maybe someone else will, on Doña Inez. It's interesting. She was a Native American from New Mexico, a Tano Indian woman. And she's given the designation Doña. Doña, that's
Yeah.
that nowadays people throw it around, Don and Doña, but back then you didn't just get that title. You had to be esteemed, or earn it to be given that title. But my understanding from what I've read is she was an amazing person. She was taken during the Castaño de Sosa expedition of 1591, taken south into Nueva España, New Spain, and then came back north. She eventually was she was the mother of at least one son of Hernan Martin Serrano, who was from Zacatecas. He's the founder of the Martinez family of New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And so their son Hernan was mestizo. One of the first New Mexicans, was part Spanish and part New Mexico Native American, and maybe the mom of the brother of the younger Hernan, Luis, who's a very common ancestor, all of us, Luis Martin Serrano. But being Native American, and obviously muy ladina, meant she spoke Spanish. She was versed in the ways of the Spanish, and why not? She was living amongst them. But obviously, she was quite intelligent. She could maneuver men, and that made her a perfect candidate to be a bruja.
Mm-hmm.
Because look at even someone like Santa Teresa de Avila, the great Catholic saint from Castilla la Vieja, Spain. She was investigated by the Inquisition. She wrote treatises. She wrote books on spirituality. They thought she might be possessed by a demon. She was investigated by the Inquisition. Why? Partly because she was a very strong, independent, intelligent woman. You see similar challenges of Sor Juana de la Cruz in Mexico City. I think Doña Inez is cut from the same cloth, if that makes sense. I'm sure she we like to, in our in our male perspective way of looking at things, we look at someone like Doña Inez as well. You know, she was with that guy, she was that guy, she was with that guy. But I think she was maneuvering the system. You know, Moraga, Martin Serrano, these were local men, soldiers who had a certain amount of influence, at least in the Nuevo Mexicano communities, the early community. And she was definitely, I think, a power broker, at least amongst the local population.
Absolutely. Now, when you give these talks on brujeria, like the audience, because the one I went to, like you said, it was just jam packed. So there's obviously a lot of interest in this, but do you ever get people who show up to push back against you?
Yes. Yes. One time, interestingly enough, I used to talk a little bit about Navajo and Puebloan witchcraft beliefs. I backed off from that. One time I had a woman from one of the Pueblos show up and really lay into me saying, you shouldn't be talking about our beliefs, and you shouldn't be talking about our who was and wasn't a witch. And I respect that. I think the native communities, if they want to talk about that, should talk about it. And then on the other side, I was going to give a talk in one community, and one of the big evangelical churches, Christian churches, I guess, were a little concerned that I might be teaching people how to be brujas, how to be witches. And
Wow.
I assured them I'm not teaching anybody how to be anything.
You should have
I'm a
owned it.
historian.
You should
Yeah.
have
Huh?
said, yeah, that's one of my hats that I wear. I wear a wizard hat.
Gandalf the
The
Brown.
official wizard of Nuevo Mexico.
Yeah.
Well, you know, so it's a topic that I'm fascinated by because I grew up hearing that. It's an ambiente that is very common in New Mexico, and it's not just New Mexico. That's what I try to point out. You can find these sort of ideas in Appalachia and Cajun country and all over Europe and Africa and Latin America. It's an idea, I think, that resonates, and I think it's something that we should talk about because some of the ideas really do resonate and reflect where we are right now with people, you know, saying, well, what does it mean to be a real American?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to be a true Christian or Catholic versus a watered down American or a traitor even? You know, the same themes are going on 200 years ago. It's just the language was a little different, you know. Edicts were to warn you to not step outside of what it means to be a good Catholic or a good Spanish person. When I say Spanish person, I don't mean a person from Spain. I mean a person who lives within the Spanish system, even if you're Native American or mestizo. So, you know, once you step out of that, accusations fly, demonizing takes place. So it matters. It matters. And it matters because I see it happening today, whether it's our national political climate or our local debates over statues and monuments and whose story is going to get told? How do we study history? Whose perspective do we tell? What do we say and what can't we say? And if we say it, why was it wrong for us to say it?
Speaking of telling stories, do you have a story
That's
for us
what
today?
I'm doing it for. What's
Do
that?
you have a story for us today? Speaking of telling stories
About?
about a bruja. You-
Oh, well, nothing too sensational. I gave this talk a couple weeks ago at a little town here in New Mexico, and somebody asked me, do they still practice witchcraft in New Mexico? And it was a jam-packed room. And I looked around and I said, are there any witches here? And the lady in the back raised her hand. And I looked at the person who asked the question. I said, yes. Yes, there are. You know, So, you know,
Well
I just
played.
I I just do my best to talk about the history and the cultural. I don't like the word baggage because it sounds like we're carrying something heavy that we don't want to carry. I would say more like cultural luggage. How about that? Cultural luggage that we have in our lives. And I think it's just
Hmm.
part of our tradition because, you know, when you look at the roots of our witch beliefs, they don't go back to one ancestor or one group of ancestors. They go back to Mesoamerica. They go back to Puebloan and Genízaro and Spanish and Catholic and Jewish and Muslim. It's an amazing mosaic and tapestry of different beliefs that actually show how much we all have in common, how similar we all are, as opposed to how different we are.
Absolutely. One of the things I came across in the documents in the Cibola project was this denunciation by some priests over the playing of patoli here in New Mexico. And that apparently, so it's a Mesoamerican game and it's associated strongly with gambling. If nobody knows, it's kind of like Parcheesi, and it's got, you know, it's ruled over by who is it? Chicomecoat? No, Makwil Xochitl.
Okay.
Makwil Xochitl is the Tateo of the games. And so the priests didn't like it because it was, I mean, you know, for a couple of reasons. It was associated with witchcraft, but also because it was associated with gambling. Like people would gamble heavily on this game. And apparently these Indios Mexicanos were teaching the Pueblo people how to play this game. And I found this document. And at first the document confused me because it kept talking about how they went into their estufas to play patoli. And I'm like, what? And then it dawned on me. I'm like, oh, they must mean kivas, right? Like they
Yeah,
went
that's their
to
kivas. Estufas are their kivas. Yeah.
so they were going into their
Well,
kivas to play patoli. And I was like, wow, that's amazing.
well, you know, gambling is another one of our traditions that goes back to all of our different cultural ancestors. I mean, you know, when Juan Paez Hurtado recruited colonists in Zacatecas in 1695, he recruited people from the casas de juegos, the casinos where where the men would go gamble. So we know that Spanish people also gambled. My grandpa in Mora played Monte, and he loved betting on the horses as well. And
Nice.
you know, this goes back. And by the way, that Vargas recruitment at Zacatecas in 1695 brought our, if not the first, some of the first tamale makers, tamaleras, from Zacatecas to New Mexico. So we've had those here a long time. But that was probably looked at as demonic, the game that the Mexican Indians were teaching the Pueblo Indians, and it was looked down upon because it was from their culture and not the Spanish culture. And you know, let's be honest, these priests had a superiority complex. They looked down on local people and local culture. And let's be clear, they looked down on the Nuevo Mexicanos too. They looked down on our ancestors because they were mixed blood, and they were also doing these things too, by the way. They were doing it too. That's why it became a problem. If you want to know what people were doing, just study all the rules and laws that said don't do this in a given time period.
Absolutely. Dr. Tlakatekatl, do you have a story?
No, actually.
I have a story. Can I tell this quick story?
Sure.
Yes.
So when I was younger, we lived down in Peralta, and there was a family member who we had a falling out with, this older woman. And one day we saw her come down to our driveway, and she came to the end of our driveway, and she made like a sign in the dirt. She threw something in the dirt, and she got in her car and she drove away. And so we were like, oh, what was that all about? And then the next day we're sitting around, we're outside, and I remember this distinctly because this owl came in and it flew and it landed on our trailer. And my dad looked at it and he called out to the owl by her name, right? And I don't want to say her name, but
no, don't say her name.
So he called out to the owl, and like the owl like turned and looked, and he threw a rock and hit the owl, and the owl flew away. And I swear, like a few weeks later, we see this woman at the supermarket and she had a broken leg. And so we were like, oh my God. I mean, obviously it's a coincidence, but I mean, at the time when you're a kid, talk about like that creeped me out so bad that I was like having nightmares about it. And it's just interesting how.
But aren't you supposed to do that to the lechuza, not just the owl? I mean, the owl is a symbol, in some indigenous traditions, a symbol of death or of an omen of death, right? Like that old Mexican saying, how's it go? Cuando tecolote canta, el indio muere, or something to that effect. And so, but the lechuza is the shapeshifter that comes, right? That's the human person that's shapeshifted into a human-sized owl. So it's not like any old owl, right?
Yeah.
So
well, in Nahuatl, it's called the Tlakatekatl.
Yeah,
the owl person.
Right.
And that was the Franciscans. Let's bring up the Franciscans. That word Tlakatekatl is specifically how they refer to demons, right? The owl person, the owl people.
Well, and even in New Mexico, we call owls tecolotes, and there's the story that if you're walking down a road and you look in the tree and see an owl, and if you tell the owl, mañana vengas por sal, and then the next day, if somebody knocks at your door and you open it, it's a neighbor or someone says, I'd like to borrow some salt, then you know they're a brujo or a bruja because they're compelled to reveal themselves to you because you ordered them to. So these are stories that I am fascinated by. I look back with respect at our ancestors because they were trying to understand and explain their world and their universe, just like we do today with medicine and our own religious expressions. And they were very intelligent people, but they had their own tools at their own disposal. And it was a world populated by saints and spirits and brujos and brujas and hechiceras. And I just think it's fascinating because we still have that stuff today. It's not just in documents or books, but we're all talking about it now still. I'm fascinated by that.
What's Carl Sagan's old book, The Demon Haunted World?
Yeah.
That's a great book. So I want to ask a question to both of you because I don't know if this is like a New Mexico thing, Southern Colorado, Texas, or it's just my family. But my grandma she would make these cross symbols with her fingers whenever we were, I forget the instance, but whenever something would happen, she would make like this cross symbol with her fingers. I remember.
Yeah, crucitas. We used to call them crucitas.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
crucitas.
You know, it's folk Catholicism. That's how I look at that. Look, in the Catholic Church, we have 7 sacraments, right? You know, you have baptism, confession, communion, priesthood, marriage, extreme unction, the last rites. Look, those are sacraments. Then you have sacramentals. Sacramentals are like you're a blessed rosary or praying of a rosary or holy water or exorcism. These are sacramentals. Well, things like that are crossing the fingers. This is a way of blessing oneself and warding off evil. It's almost like a sacramental, or it's in that same realm of protecting oneself against mal ojo, evil eye, or a curse or a hex. And it's the same thing as blessing oneself, right? When you do the sign of the cross. And our religion, and you can find it in Mexico too, it's folk Catholicism. That's why when LeMay came and, bishops from Durango, like Zubiria or Tamaroni, Romeral, they came here, they were a little freaked out at us because we had our own way of doing this. The late Jesuit priest, Father Tom Steele, described it as un misticismo tosco here in New Mexico, a
Interesting.
rough-hewn mysticism that evolved through the centuries, that was made up of ritual and prayer, that brought people incredibly close to God, because we were so far away from Durango
Right.
and Mexico City and Toledo and Madrid. So we were very personally connected, and the saints weren't just statues or people who lived 1,000 years ago. They were like our relatives, like our tio or our tia. We're close to our saints. So we did these things. These are our religious expressions, and they helped ward off. Right around the corner of an adobe church could be a bruja or a santo. We didn't know what we were going to see. So that's the realm of our ancestors.
It's kind of like a frontier tradition, right? It's so far from the
Yeah.
metropole, and it has to adapt to its environment. So I did remember just now a story when you brought up the crucitas, Curly. My grandmother, it brought back memories, and when I was a little kid, like that's one of the things that she used to do. I remember distinctly she would do the crucitas. But one thing that I do remember that I got to witness, and this is a story that has stuck with me, and I had forgotten about it, but it just came to me right now. That I remember one time in my dad's hometown, there was this very bad storm that was in the distance, and you could see it headed in the direction of the pueblo. And I remember she distinctly like gathering some things, like some herbs and some water, and she had a crucifix, but she also grabbed a machete, and she went to the because we lived or they lived right down the street from a major intersection, the main thoroughfare through that town. So we were like a block and a half away. She went to that intersection because it's in the shape of a cross, right? It's an intersection, and she took out the water and with the yerba, and she was like, saying a prayer. To the four directions. I mean, I distinctly remember she was going, north, south, east, west, and then she grabbed the machete and she started like doing the same thing with the machete in the directions. And then she turned to the direction of the storm and like was exiting it, like cutting it to try to get it to go away. And lo and behold, the storm disappeared. And so, like you were saying, you're a young kid, and it's like, wow, that's impressive. Like she just did something, right? She cursed this storm, and it just went away and missed us all together. And she had this whole ritual that she did, and it was something that was very impressive. It was beautiful.
Oh yeah, that's
Well,
amazing.
well, now you're making me think. Now, about 15 years ago, I do a lot of genealogy, and I did my DNA genealogy, and I wanted my padrino to I wanted to do his DNA. Get a swab from the mouth. So I went up to the norte, and I saw him. And I go, Tio, can I do a DNA test? I'll just have to swab inside your cheek. It won't hurt or anything. And he just said, no, mijo, no, mijo, no. Me van a embrujar. He said, no, they'll bewitch me. That goes back to the idea of when you cut your hair or your fingernails,
Yeah.
you're supposed to burn them so they could not be used against you in a curse or a hex. So I think he was on to something. He knew. He goes, no, you're part of me and give it to other people. No.
Wow.
Nice.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Do you have...
Me too. Thank you for having me.
So state historian Rob Martinez, thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciated it.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
We hope to have you back again soon to talk more about history and our connections to all these amazing, places in the past and how they all intersect here in our beautiful state of New Mexico. So thank you very, very much for coming on, friend.
Pues muchas gracias, amigos, for having me. And remember, the truth is like medicine. It doesn't always taste good, but it is always good for you.
Órale.
Thanks, man. This
Órale.
was great.
Yeah. Great
You
one.
got it.
Really-
Thanks for having me.